I came home to find my $30,000 solar panel system torn out of the ground, shattered into a pile of twisted metal and broken glass. It looked like a tornado had personally declared war on my front yard, except there was no tornado, just Karen. She stood there, arms crossed, a smug smile on her face, as if she had just solved world hunger instead of committing daylight robbery. "You were warned," she said, shaking her head. "The HA does not allow unsightly additions to the neighborhood." Unsightly additions. My solar panels were state-of-the-art, sleek, and barely visible from the road. Meanwhile, Karen's own house looked like it was stuck in a bad 1980s sitcom, complete with plastic flamingos and an oversized gnome army guarding her front lawn. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice calm. "You just destroyed my legally installed property. You know this is illegal, right?" Karen let out a patronizing sigh, the kind reserved for a toddler throwing a tantrum. "It's not illegal when the WHO enforces its rules, and I have full authority here, Alex. Next time, maybe you'll think twice before going against us." I stared at her, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. I had read horror stories about WHO, but I never thought I'd be living in one, and certainly not under a woman who seemed to believe she was the queen of the cul-de-sac. "What about my money?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Who's paying for this?" Karen gave me a sickly sweet smile. "Not my problem. Maybe next time follow the rules." Then she turned around and walked away, leaving me standing there watching the wreckage of what had been my prized energy solution. The worst part, the HOA had no jurisdiction over solar panels in this state. She had no legal ground to stand on. But I knew exactly why she did it, because she thought I couldn't fight back. That was her first mistake. 2 days later, I sat in my home office sipping coffee and staring at my laptop screen where legal documents were spread across multiple tabs. I had been doing some research, deep research, and what I found nearly made me spit my drink across the room. The HOA didn't own the power grid in this neighborhood. I did. The discovery sent a thrill through me. When I bought my house, the land had been part of a larger private property sale. The previous developer had installed a private power system for the HOA before dissolving their ownership, which meant in layman's terms that the grid supplying power to every single house in this HOA was technically mine. A slow grin spread across my face. Karen thought she had power over me. She had no idea that I literally had power over her. The gears in my head started turning. Legally, I could do whatever I wanted with my property, including shutting off service to anyone I deemed unworthy. It wouldn't take much, just a couple of switches, a few adjustments to the grid, and then one glorious night Karen and the rest of her little home minions would experience what it felt like to be powerless. I decided to play it smart. I didn't act immediately. Instead, I let Karen bask in her victory, watching her strut around the neighborhood, relishing in the authority she thought she had. Meanwhile, I made quiet preparations. I wanted this to be a lesson not just for Karen, but for the entire HOA board that enabled her. The night of the blackout was chosen carefully. Karen had planned one of her infamous HOA meetings, the kind where she forced homeowners to sit through 2 hours of herself congratulatory nonsense, all while handing out fines for things like grass growing too fast or porch lights being the wrong shade of white at exactly 8 p.m., just as she was beginning her speech about why everyone needed to repaint their mailboxes to match her house's trim. I pressed the final button on my control panel, and the entire neighborhood went dark. It was glorious. A chorus of confused voices filled the night air as the HOA meeting came to an abrupt and unscheduled end. The entire neighborhood had plunged into darkness in an instant. Porch lights, street lamps, security cameras, and even Karen's obnoxiously bright chandelier, which she insisted made her living room look like a palace, all flickered off simultaneously. Panic spread as homeowners shuffled around, muttering in confusion, their phones lighting up the dim streets like fireflies. Karen's voice cut through the night sharp and demanding, "What the hell is going on? Someone get the power company on the phone." I stood on my front porch sipping a cold beer and watching the chaos unfold. Neighbors stumbled out of their homes, some already dialing customer service, others yelling across lawns to see if anyone knew what had happened. I had to fight the urge to grin. No one knew, no one suspected a thing. After 10 minutes of shouting, Karen decided to take charge. She stomped over to her assistant, a frazzled man named Richard, and snapped her fingers. "Call the electric company. I want an explanation now." Richard fumbled with his phone, whispering something under his breath before holding it up to his ear. A few moments later, he frowned. "They're saying there's no outage in the area, no service issues." Karen's head whipped around. "That's impossible. Look around. Do you see any lights on?" I decided it was time to make my move. I walked casually toward the crowd, feigning concern. "Like everyone else. Strange, isn't it?" I mused aloud. "An outage that only affects the whole neighborhood, nowhere else in town." Karen turned, her eyes narrowing. "What do you know about this?" I shrugged. "I know that the power grid here isn't controlled by the city, it's private." I let the words hang for a moment, enjoying the slow dawning of realization creeping onto her face. Richard gulped audibly. "Wait, private? Then who I smiled me the crowd fell into stunned silence. A few neighbors gasped while others exchanged confused glances. Karen's face twitched, her brain clearly working overtime to process what she had just heard. What do you mean you? She snapped. I own the grid, the power lines, the transformers, the whole system. The HOA doesn't own it, they just use it. Or well, they did. I took a sip of my beer, letting the words sink in. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She pointed an accusing finger at me. You're lying. I pulled out my phone, and with a few taps displayed a scanned copy of the property deed and utility record. I turned the screen toward her. Go ahead, read it. Karen snatched the phone from my hand, her eyes darting across the document. As she read, her face went through an entire roller coaster of emotions: confusion, disbelief, horror. The color drained from her cheeks. This can't be right, she whispered. The HOA has jurisdiction over everything in this community. Not this, I corrected, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Turns out the developer sold off the power grid with part of the land years ago, and I bought that land. Richard let out a low whistle. So you can turn it back on, right? I nodded. Of course. I just don't feel like it. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some homeowners, now fully aware of the situation, started directing their frustration at Karen. Wait. One woman piped up. So this means Alex can cut off power whenever he wants? A man from down the street groaned. Oh, that's just perfect. So what, we have to pay him for electricity? Now I held up my hands. Not exactly. I'm not charging anyone anything extra. I was perfectly happy keeping the power running smoothly for free. But then Karen decided she could destroy my solar panels and get away with it. A ripple of anger moved through the group. Homeowners who had previously tolerated Karen's antics were now eyeing her with suspicion and frustration. The reality of the situation had finally sunk in. She had poked the wrong bear, and now they were all paying for it. Karen's composure cracked. You can't do this. This is extortion. You have to turn the power back on. I took another sip of my beer, letting the silence stretch just long enough before responding. I don't have to do anything, but I'll make you a deal. I'll turn the power back on right now if you agree to two things. Her eyes narrowed. What things? First, you will personally replace every single solar panel you destroyed. I gestured toward my property, where the remains of my system still lay in a pathetic heap at your own expense. No HOA funds, no sneaky fines against other homeowners. Your money. Karen's lips thinned. And the second you resign as HOA president tonight. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Karen's eyes bulged, her hands balling into fists. You can't be serious. I shrugged. Fine, enjoy the blackout. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few people whispered to each other, agreeing that maybe it wasn't such a bad idea. Then a man named Jeff, who had been fined last month for having an unauthorized garden gnome, stepped forward. You know what? I second that. Let's vote. Karen whirled around. What? Jeff crossed his arms. A vote. Right now, all in favor of Karen resigning. One by one, hands started going up, slowly at first, then more confidently. Karen's face twisted in horror. You ungrateful traitors, she shrieked. The last hand went up. The decision was clear. Karen stood there fuming, shaking, unable to process what had just happened. I didn't say another word. Instead, I pulled out my phone and tapped a single button, and the lights came back on for everyone except Karen's house. Karen stood frozen in the middle of the street, her expression flickering between disbelief and outrage, as the entire neighborhood around her lit up, except for her house. Porch lights glowed, street lamps hummed back to life, TVs flickered on behind curtains, and the warm buzz of electricity returned to every home. But hers. People cheered, relieved that the blackout was finally over. But Karen, she was still stuck in the dark, both literally and figuratively. She spun around to face me, eyes burning with fury. Turn my power back on. Right now. I took my time, sipping the last of my beer before answering. No. A vein in her forehead pulsed. This is illegal. You can't cut off my electricity just because you feel like it. I smiled. I didn't cut off your electricity. The grid's back on. Everyone else has power. If your house isn't getting any, well, maybe you should check with the HOA. Oh, wait, you were the HOA? A ripple of laughter passed through the gathered homeowners. Karen's face flushed red with embarrassment. But she wasn't done yet. She stormed back toward her house, yanking out her phone. I'll get an electrician. Over here. You won't get away with this. I waited, casually leaning against my porch railing, as she furiously tapped on her phone, calling every electrician in town. It only took about 5 minutes before she stomped back down the street, her entire body radiating frustration. They're all booked, she gritted out. 4 weeks. I pretended to be surprised. That's crazy, almost like no one wants to deal with HOA nonsense. Who would have thought? The truth was I had spoken to a few electricians earlier in the day. I simply let them know they might get a panicked call from a certain power-abusing ex-president, and that if they valued their sanity, they might want to be unavailable for a while. They had all happily agreed. After all, Karen had fined half the service industry for ridiculous things like parking too long in a driveway, or using a ladder that was the wrong color. The realization that she was completely alone seemed to dawn on her, without her title, without power, without anyone willing to fix her problem. She had nothing left to stand on. She was used to ruling this neighborhood with an iron fist, but that fist was now trembling. Neighbors started whispering to one another, some openly mocking her. Few even walked up to me to shake my hand, thanking me for putting an end to Karen's reign of terror. Meanwhile, she was pacing, chewing her lip, like she was trying to find some kind of loophole to dig herself out of this mess. Then, like a cornered animal, she tried one last desperate move. "I'll sue you." I tilted my head for what she hesitated, then jabbed a finger in my direction. For cutting off my power, you're violating some kind of law. There has to be something illegal about this, I sighed. Dramatically, Karen, I own the power grid. Remember, there's no law that says I have to supply power to a private property, especially one that violated my property rights. First, if anything, I could sue you for destruction of my solar panels. Actually, you know what I think I will. Her jaw nearly hit the pavement. You wouldn't dare. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, filing the claim. Right now shouldn't be too hard. I've got security footage of the crew you hired tearing my property apart. Might as well send it over to the cops while I'm at it. Vandalism, destruction of private property. That's got to be what, a few thousand in damages. Karen's breath hitched. And since you're no longer HOA president, I assume you'll have to cover the costs yourself. Oh, and don't forget the replacement panels you agreed to pay for. Should be a hefty bill. Silence stretched between us. For the first time since I moved into this neighborhood, Karen looked small, defeated. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The gears were turning in her head. She wasn't just out of power, she was out of options. Finally, she did what I never thought I'd see. She turned around, shoulders slumped, and walked away. Not another word, just the sound of her shoes scraping against the pavement. As she disappeared into her dark, powerless house, the crowd started dispersing, people laughing and chatting as they returned to their homes. Jeff, the guy with the gnome collection, clapped me on the back. That was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen. Glad I could help, I said, with a grin. Over the next few days, Karen kept a low profile without the HOA backing her up. She was just another homeowner, one without electricity. At that, she tried appealing to some of the neighbors, but no one was interested in helping her. The people she had spent years bullying had no sympathy for her situation. Then one morning I woke up to see a moving truck in her driveway. She was leaving by noon. The truck was packed, and she stood outside one last time, looking around at the neighborhood she had once controlled. When her eyes met mine, there was no smugness left, just bitter resignation. She didn't say goodbye, just got into her car and drove off. That night, I made one final adjustment to the power grid. Karen's house lit up again, but it was too late for her to enjoy it. A few weeks later, with the HOA under new management, I installed a new solar panel system, this time reinforced and under legal protection that not even the HOA could touch. The neighborhood felt different now, lighter, freer. People started putting up decorations without fear of fines. Kids played in yards without Karen barking at them to stay off the grass. The ridiculous rules vanished. To celebrate, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue. For the first time in years, people actually came together, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. It was a good night, and just for fun, I installed one last addition, a solar-powered spotlight aimed directly at Karen's old house. It switched on every night at sunset, bathing the empty property in a warm golden glow, a reminder of what happens when you mess with the wrong guy.